if you want to compete with the Chinese, you can't do it on price because the Chinese will always underprice you. So you have to do it on quality. Quality in this broader sense with respect for ESGs. So you have to build in these governance aspects in your investment program if you want to add value compared to your competitors.
Good afternoon, my name is Amandine Sabourin, and we are looking today at the changes in the European Union's international partnerships. Today's episode will focus on one of those changes, the increasing weight of financial modalities and tools to do loans, blending, guarantees. To talk about it, we're joined today by Philippe van Damme, former EU ambassador to Guinea, Zimbabwe, and Cameroon. Good afternoon, Philippe.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for being with us this afternoon. My first question will be very general about the Global Gateway strategy. There has been one argument put forward regarding the strategy, saying that it was mostly geopolitical, aiming at countering the influence of other powers in Africa and other partner countries. We would like to look at the strategy. Can you talk a little bit about the scope of the strategy? Some say it's more about rebranding than anything else, but what can you say about it?
There is nothing wrong with rebranding to the extent that, of course, it remains meaningful in terms of substance. But let's maybe first return to the definition of the Global Gateway before starting commenting on, is it a defensive tool against the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative or whatsoever? If you look to the website of the Global Gateway, it says that global strategy is a strategy created to boost, and I'm quoting now, smart, clean, and secure connections in digital, energy, and transport sectors, and to strengthen health, education, research systems across the world. Now, if you look to that definition, I don't see anything particularly original in that. It covers basically all the main sectors of intervention of traditional development cooperation. The only thing I see there which is missing in terms of scope now is all aspects, maybe the most sensitive aspects related to labor mobility. When you speak about connectivity, you speak about labor mobility, migration, but also everything which has to do with the governance dimension of development cooperation. And that's a little bit what worries me in that definition, because although there are some references made to policy dialogue and so forth, the emphasis is very much on investments in physical infrastructure and to a certain extent also human capital investments, but crowding out economic and political governance issues. Now, if you promote investments and your investment climate is not adapted, you may wonder to what extent your policy will be effective and impactful. I mean, the ambition of Global Gateway is to be transformational. Now, there are a lot of confusions here about what is transformational, and very often, if you look to the documents, you have the impression that people are mixing up the size of a project with transformation. I mean, you can be very transformational with very small targeted projects, notably in the governance field, to improve the climate, the investment climate or the business environment. So it shouldn't be a question of size. It should be a question of what we're targeting and what you're reaching out with. But the main problem by neglecting governance issues is that you may achieve investments in the short term, but the impact becomes very uncertain. And we have had this experience in the past. I mean, one of the big flagships which we are promoting, and which is an interesting project in itself, is a huge hydroelectric dam which we are building in Nachtigal, with a lot of member states contributions, private sector, development banks, and so forth. So an interesting project in itself. It's not new because it's as I said, it predates the global gateway. But the problem is that the electricity sector has huge governance challenges in Cameroon. The distribution network is leaking. They're undervoicing and you're under-collecting, which means that the sector is structurally in deficit, which means that basically we have no guarantees that the electricity which will be provided by this hydroelectric dam, which will substantially increase potentially the global supply within the country, it will increase global supply by 20-30%, we have no guarantees that they will be able to deliver in the medium long term, because we are not sure that the distribution network will follow. We are not sure that the maintenance investments will follow, that indeed there will be any capital left to reinvest. And the conclusion is that a lot of private sector investors in that first dam were extremely reluctant to consider joining the construction of a second dam. And that's then come to the second part. That's the scope. But if you look now to the implementation modalities, as you know, the implementation modalities are based on the fact that development assistance is only what we call now the oil in the engine, but that the source of growth should be private sector of development bank based investments through equity, through loans, through whatever. Now, if you reckon on these private sector contributions, you may say, how can we convince them to bring in their capital? And you can do it by what Global Gateway calls de-risking, giving guarantees, investment guarantees. Now, guarantees mutualize the risk, shift the risk from the investor to other partners, but are not de-risking the risk. They don't diminish the risk, but the risk is spread over more partners, because the only way of really de-risking in the substantive way is by improving economic and political governance. The third problem is in this thing is that the EU has to trust the agent, the investors, in that they will respect the strategic priorities set out by the EU, including the compliance with what we call the ESG standards, so the environmental, social, governance standards. Now, a private sector has a benefits-driven logic, and these two sensitivities, these values-driven sensitivity of the EU and the profit-making sensitivity of the private sector may clash. My impression today is that Global Gateway may be overselling its potential, and with the risk also of underperforming, because you have to convince the private sector to come on board. And if you're not tackling the governance environment, that will become extremely difficult, even with your guarantees.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Maybe to concentrate on what you were saying about the way governance is not in it. Just a very maybe a clarification question on you mentioned the environmental, social, and governance standards that allow to put some guidelines a little bit and to place the discussion, the climate priority, the social priority, and the governance one in the discussion with the private sector. But this is not the so that increases the transaction costs. I understand, but you have other means to address the governance-related issues, right?
Yes.
Like,
but they have to go. They have to go hand in hand. That's what I'm saying.
Yes.
I mean, you have to do things in combination, and that's in theory the spirit behind Global Gateway, because that's what should differentiate Global Gateway from the Chinese approach, because the Chinese approach is, let's say, no conditions attached. Right? You do your investment and you don't care about all the rest. Now, if you want to compete with the Chinese, you can't do it on price, because the Chinese will always underprice you. So you have to do it on quality. Quality in this broader sense with respect for ESGs. So you have to build in these governance aspects in your investment program if you want to add value compared to your competitors. So you have two options. Basically, you compete to the bottom with the Chinese and you forget all your specificities as Europe and you will lose out. Or indeed you say, no, we stick to our standards, to our norms, to our values, and we could compete with the Chinese and others, not on price, but on the quality of what we're doing, and therefore also on the longer term impact of what we're doing. Because again, investing in infrastructure without accompanying measures will not create the impact which is announced.
Our series of podcasts looks really at the implications for the partner countries and at partner country level, and especially building on what you just said. I wanted to ask you about how this change, this major change of approach, is perceived and received by the partner countries and beyond.
Well, you assume that this is a major change, but as I said, if you look to the definition objectively, I don't see any major change. I mean, the sector's focus is something very traditional. The blending is something we have been speaking about for years. So there's nothing revolutionary. It's a rebranding. Okay, it tries to bring different aspects together in one comprehensive approach. But comprehensive approach, we have been developing that in the past as well. You know, the territorial integrated projects in the past were also comprehensive approaches. So, but there's nothing wrong again into rebranding on condition that you don't rebrand every 5 minutes, because the perception from, I'm now speaking from the partner country side, is that you're a little bit tired, because we have been launching initiative on initiative for, well, let's say every new commissioner has its new dada, and so we are redesigning things. We are repackaging, we are presenting them as something new. We are also representing we create the impression sometimes that they will be additional funding, but in fact, the additional funding, there may be additional funding if you are successful in attracting private sector funding and development bank concessional loans. But the ODA part, the concessional part from the EU and from the member states will not increase. So it's the leverage we hope to increase. But so, and we sometimes create expectations which we can't fulfill. Right? So we may, because we announced that we would mobilize 300 billion worldwide, half of it for Africa by 2027. We are halfway the NDICI budgetary cycle, and we have still to start basically with the new funding under what they now call the EFSD+. So there is a delivery problem, one. There is people are a little bit tired of the continuous repackaging and the focus on the marketing and on the quantitative sides of things, because people always say we should no longer be payers but players, but the focus nevertheless is on the quantitative aspects of things. And it is perceived as a defensive response to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. So I think we have to be extremely careful vis-à-vis the governments, not to disappoint them in terms of the delivery gap due to the delays in operationalization, and in the additionality gap, as I said. The multiplier effect may be disappointing in context where there is a lack of governance. But there are other aspects to it as well. And I think that, for example, civil society feels hugely frustrated, because we always speak about a partnership of equals. But this whole concept has been conceived unilaterally in Brussels headquarters without any real consultation. So we have to be careful also in our narrative and that our narrative is adapted to what we are doing on the ground. And there is a discrepancy between what we say and how we behave. And it's clearly not something which has been perceived as based on a broad consultation with the partner countries, but even less so with the civil society and the partner countries. So they have the feeling, okay, they have been consulted at a certain moment, pro forma and too late. So too little, too late. And their concern, of course, is that, as I said, you have this principal agent problem, which means that private sector may, in fact, not respond to the development priorities and the strategic priorities we have been fixing. And therefore, it's important that you have monitoring systems in place locally, which check to what extent, indeed, the implementation of these investments respond indeed to the concerns. And therefore, it's absolutely necessary that you find a mechanism to involve the local communities and local civil society in the monitoring of your investments. And that's still, I'm afraid, a weak element in this whole global gateway framework.
Would that be the only role you see for civil society in the whole of global gateway framework, which is already a consistent role? But do you see another space for civil society?
Again, if you move away from the pure physical infrastructure investments and you add the investment in human capital, which includes capacity building, you add the governance aspects, which includes also investing in democratization, preservation of public space, accountability, and so forth. Of course, you can see a role from civil society in these accompanying measures. So they have a monitoring role, they have a role in the implementation of accompanying measures, but they also have a role, and that's the traditional role of civil society recognized already under Cotonou, of indeed contributing to the policy making. They should be part of the policy dialogue as well, as in the past. So we have to be careful that the Global Gateway doesn't crowd out these important partners and that we are not regressing on these. Which brings me, in fact, to a third partner, which we very often forget. What's the perception of the private sector? And as I said, they may have different ambitions and objectives. And of course, they may feel very uncomfortable with all these governance-related conditionalities. The ESG, I mean, a lot of partners, of course, comply or try to comply with environmental, social governance standards. But of course, the monitoring of all these may scare off some of them because there's a huge reputational risk attached to these as well. The second aspect which may put them off is also the administrative burdens of these mechanisms. We have been speaking about that mechanism for the last couple of years. Again, there are huge delays. Now, the time horizon of a private sector investor may not be the same as the time horizon of a public administration like ours, so they may be scared off by the slow decision-making processes, the heaviness of this decision-making process as well. So we really have to think through how these global gateway mechanisms and the blending and guarantee mechanisms will be worked out so that indeed they're responding to the way private sector takes decisions. And then finally, I think a factor which may be a little bit underestimated is, again, coming back to the political economy of bureaucracies, is that the EU itself is a bureaucracy with its own internal dynamics. And I know that in INPA, the International Partnership Director General, there are a lot of questions about the direction we are taking. And some people have commented on that leaked internal document prepared by INPA for the future incoming commission. And we see there that there is an increasing worry that the initial prime objectives of our development cooperation as defined in the Treaty on the European Union and in the subsequent documents may be lost in this whole process, because the prime objective is, and still is, to my knowledge at least, poverty reduction and SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. That's one aspect. The second aspect is the relationship with the member state. We haven't spoken about it because, of course, not yet. But of course, the idea behind Global Gateway is that we do things collectively with the member states under the Team Europe flag. Now, that means that the member states fully play the game. Now, it's not the first time that we try to work with the member states and to do things collectively. You remember the discussions 20 years ago around joint programming, delegated cooperation, and so forth. Now, it failed at a certain moment for different reasons, and it's important to think through why it didn't go as far as we wanted. But one of the aspects is, of course, also the asymmetric nature of this relationship. The EU is pushing very much, is sharing its flag under Team Europe, its visibility, and a lot of, notably smaller member states are most happy to join that Team Europe flag because it gives them visibility without huge investments. But the big member states with huge and well-developed development agencies see a possibility there to capture some of the EU funds and to what someone called in the past bilateralize the implementation of the community development cooperation. And this asymmetry between the big member states with huge and well-developed development agencies capturing some of the funds, the Commission losing maybe in that process some of the visibility and control on the member states, and then the smaller member states who may feel crowded out may create tensions in the system. So we also have to be extremely careful that in this Team Europe spirit we build in more symmetry and that we are ensured that the EU maintains control on implementation and control on visibility, so that indeed the sum of all the contributions is more than the individual contributions, and that everybody within the EU and the member states benefit from the Team Europe spirit and dynamic.
Just a final question, maybe, because this is also linked, this re-bilateralization you're talking about is also happening at the same time when the member states have less and less budget available for official development aid. So there is a need for them to maybe not use or capture the EU funds, but to use the EU context to still be more present. So in that context, what would be your, very briefly, your few recommendations maybe, or ideas for the upcoming challenges?
It's absolutely clear indeed that member states have received favorably the Global Gateway and Team Europe flag initiative, precisely for reasons you mentioned, that they have decreasing bilateral funding flows, and by uniting behind the EU flag, they maintain visibility on the cheap, let's say. So I have no problem at all with that. Team Europe is an extremely powerful brand, I think, which sells very well on the ground. But the member states have to play the game. Again, it's good to have all the member state flags under the EU flag for funds, for projects funded by the EU. But the opposite should be true as well. All funds, all projects funded by bilateral cooperations under the Global Gateway heading should also recognize that they are part of an all of EU type of initiative, and therefore that the EU flag should be visible as well. So I think it's extremely important to play that Team Europe flagging in a more balanced way, so that we give visibility to the member states, but that the member states also give visibility to the EU, and that collectively we see the EU's presence all over the place. You know, I'm often telling that anecdote. When I was on mission in Benin a long time ago, I was in the lobby of the hotel and I asked for the EU delegation, and in the lobby nobody knew what I was talking about. And I insisted, but they said, I don't know where they are. And then it was someone coming to the lobby as well, someone from the World Bank asking for the World Bank office. And at the lobby they could immediately tell him where they could find the World Bank office. So I was a little bit vexed. And I insisted, and in the end I said, well, now the EDF office. And then immediately there was that brand recognition. Say, the EDF. Okay, the EDF, you can find their office there. So branding is important. And when you circulate in a country, you have these panels with a flag. It's always pleasant for us, but it's also in terms of communication. Useful for people to recognize the European flag. Say, because one of the things we see in this geopolitical context today of increased competition is that some donors manage to get more visibility, more also public appeal than others. And when you do these public opinion surveys, the European Union has an extremely low recognition level. So you have to think that through. And the only way of doing that is by putting all our means together collectively, so that each, even small project of a small member state has the national flag, but also an EU flag, so that people say, okay, this is part of a real common EU-driven effort.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for joining me today to talk about these changes happening at the EU level on international partnerships and the way the EU works with partner countries and also with member states. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome.